Throughout human history, sharing a meal has always been more than just eating. It's a time for connection, for community, for conversation. We gather with family and friends to celebrate milestones, to mourn losses, to simply share in the fabric of daily life. But you know, certain meals transcend the everyday. They become etched in our collective memory, their significance echoing down through the centuries. Of all the meals ever shared, one stands alone in its profound impact on the world. It was a simple supper, held in an upper room in Jerusalem over 2,000 years ago. A gathering of a teacher and his closest followers, a Passover meal that would become the most famous and influential dinner in all of history. This meal is known to us as the Last Supper. It was the final time Jesus of Nazareth would break bread with his 12 disciples before his crucifixion. On the surface, it was a traditional Jewish Passover Seder, a ritual meal commemorating the liberation of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. Yet, this particular Passover would be unlike any other. It was a night filled with deep emotion, startling revelations, acts of profound humility. The events that unfolded around that table would lay the foundation for a new covenant and become a central sacrament for billions of people across the globe, a story retold and reenacted for millennia. The story of the Last Supper is a cornerstone of the Christian faith. It's a moment packed with symbolism and foreshadowing, a quiet evening that held the weight of the world's future upon its shoulders. What was said and done in that room has been the subject of countless paintings, theological debates, personal reflections. It's a story of friendship. It's a story of betrayal. It's a story of service. It's a story of sacrifice. It's a story of love. It's a story of loss. To understand the significance of this meal is to gain a deeper insight into the very heart of the Christian narrative and the teachings of the man at its center. A man who knew this would be his final meal with those he loved most. For the 12 disciples gathered with Jesus, the evening began like many others they had shared. They were a close-knit group, bound together by their shared journey and their devotion to their charismatic leader. They had traveled with him, witnessed his miracles, listened to his teachings about love, forgiveness, and a new kingdom. As they reclined at the table in the fading light of that Thursday evening, they had little idea of the dramatic turn their lives were about to take. They were about to participate in a moment that would not only define their own destinies, but would also shape the course of human history forever. The importance of the Last Supper cannot be overstated. It's far more than just a historical event, it's a moment of profound theological weight. He took simple, everyday elements, bread and wine, and gave them new meaning. Bread, wine. He spoke of his body being broken, his blood being shed. These words established the sacrament of communion, the Eucharist. Today it remains central in worship for Christians around the world. This evening was also a night of intense prophecy. He foretold his own betrayal by one of their own. Betrayal. He predicted Peter would deny him 3 times. Rooster crowing. These were specific, personal, deeply troubling prophecies. They cast a dark shadow over the Passover celebration. Yet, amidst those prophecies, there was promise and comfort. A new commandment. Love one another. He spoke of preparing a place for them. He promised the coming of a comforter, the Holy Spirit. Those words became a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. Therefore, the Last Supper is a pivotal moment. The calm before the storm. The final lesson from the teacher. The last intimate gathering of friends before tragedy. It encapsulates Jesus' message: selfless love, humble service, ultimate sacrifice, to appreciate what followed. The arrest, the trial, the crucifixion. We must first sit at this table, understand the love, the sorrow, and the world-changing promises made in that upper room. The preparations for this fateful meal began in secrecy. Jerusalem was bustling with activity. Pilgrims from all over had flooded the city for the Passover festival. The air was thick with anticipation and the aromas of roasting lamb. For Jesus and his disciples, however, the mood was different. The city was not just a place of celebration, it was a place of growing danger. Religious leaders were openly hostile towards Jesus. They saw his teachings and his popularity with the common people as a direct threat to their authority. Finding a safe place to observe the Passover was a matter of great importance. Jesus knew the risks. He understood that his time was short. So he took matters into his own hands with a plan that was both simple and mysterious. He called 2 of his most trusted disciples, Peter and John. Peter, John. He gave them very specific, almost cryptic instructions. "Go into the city," he told them, "and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him." This was an unusual sight. In that culture, carrying water was typically a woman's task. A man carrying a water jar would stand out in the crowded streets, making him an easy marker for the two disciples to spot and follow discreetly. Peter and John did as they were instructed. They entered Jerusalem through its ancient gates, their senses overwhelmed by the sights and sounds of the festival. They scanned the crowds, searching for the sign Jesus had described. Soon enough, they saw him, a man, just as Jesus had said. He moved through the throngs with a heavy jar of water on his shoulder. Without a word, they began to follow him. The man led them through winding alleyways and past busy market stalls, seemingly unaware that he was being followed. He was the key to securing the location for their final meal together, a silent guide in a divine plan. The disciples followed the man to a house. Jesus had told them what to say next. They were to approach the owner of the house and deliver a simple message. The teacher asks, "Where is the guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?" The message implied a pre-existing arrangement, a secret understanding between Jesus and the homeowner. There was no need for lengthy explanations or negotiations. The owner would understand. This careful, clandestine planning ensured that their location would remain hidden from those who wished Jesus harm, allowing for one last, uninterrupted evening of fellowship and teaching. Upon hearing the disciples' message, the owner of the house did not hesitate. He immediately showed them to a large upper room. This was not some small forgotten space. The scriptures describe it as large and furnished, spacious, comfortable, already prepared and waiting. Set apart from the street below, a tranquil haven, cushions for reclining, as was the custom, and a long, low table, the centerpiece for the feast. It was a generous and welcoming space. Peter and John would have been impressed. The room was clean, ready, and waiting. Everything was in its place. Their task now was to make the final preparations for the Seder meal itself. This involved several important steps rooted in deep tradition. They would have needed to acquire all the necessary elements for the Passover. This included unleavened bread, matzah, bitter herbs, wine. The most significant part of the preparation would have been arranging for the Passover lamb. According to Jewish law, a lamb had to be sacrificed at the temple. Its blood was a reminder of the lamb's blood the Israelites placed on their doorposts to be saved from the final plague in Egypt. Peter and John would have had to take a lamb to the temple priests, have it sacrificed, and then bring it back to the upper room to be roasted. This was a central and solemn part of the Passover ritual, an act steeped in generations of history and meaning, connecting their meal directly to the story of their ancestors' liberation. As the sun began to set over Jerusalem, casting long shadows across the city, the preparations were complete. The upper room was transformed. It was now a sacred space, filled with the soft glow of oil lamps. The table was set with all the symbolic foods. The roasted lamb was ready, the wine was poured. Everything was in order for the arrival of Jesus and the other 10 disciples. The stage was set for a meal that would begin as a traditional Passover celebration, but would end as something entirely new, a moment that would change the world forever. Peter and John had fulfilled their duty, preparing the space for the most important supper in history. As twilight settled over the ancient city, Jesus and the remaining 10 disciples made their way through the now darkening streets of Jerusalem. The sounds of celebration from other homes echoed around them, but their own group was quiet, wrapped in their own thoughts. They navigated familiar paths to the house where Peter and John had made everything ready. Climbing the outer stairs, they entered the upper room. Warm, flickering oil lamps greeted them, illuminating a scene of perfect preparation. The table was set, the food was prepared, the air held a solemn expectation. The disciples had arrived. Jesus entered the room, framed in soft light commanding the space. He was their teacher, he was their rabbi, he was the man they had left everything to follow. The disciples stood to greet him, faces showing reverence, faces showing affection. He offered a quiet blessing for the home, and for the meal they were about to share. His eyes met each follower. He saw Peter, bold and impulsive. He saw Andrew, steady the brother. He saw Thomas, ever questioning. He saw Judas, keeper of their money. Judas standing among them, closest friend and betrayer. The disciples took their places around the low table, reclining on cushions in the customary fashion, a posture of comfort, a posture of intimacy, designed for long conversations and shared fellowship. They had shared countless meals like this before, on dusty roadsides, in homes of welcoming strangers. But this time was different. A subtle tension hung in the air, an unspoken awareness that this night was significant. The secrecy of the arrangements and the growing hostility in the city created an undercurrent of unease that the room could not entirely dispel. For Jesus, this moment was profoundly poignant. He looked upon the faces of the men he had chosen, the ones he had taught and mentored for 3 years. He knew what the coming hours held, the agony, and the sacrifice that awaited. He knew the confusion and the fear that would soon engulf these men. He wanted this one last evening to be a time of teaching, of comfort, and of final preparation. As they settled around the table, the meal was about to begin, but the first interactions were not celebration. They were a quiet, building solemnity. The mood in the upper room was not one of joyous festival. While other families across Jerusalem were celebrating the Passover with songs and laughter, a heavy quietness settled over this particular gathering. Songs, laughter. The disciples could sense a shift in their master. There was a gravity in his demeanor, a sorrow in his eyes that they had not seen before. Gravity in his demeanor, sorrow in his eyes. He was present with them, yet his thoughts seemed to be on another, more distant horizon. This created a somber atmosphere that was far from the celebratory spirit of Passover. The usual light-hearted banter and easy conversation among the friends seemed to be absent this evening. Light-hearted banter, easy conversation. The disciples themselves were likely on edge. They were not ignorant of the dangers surrounding them. They had witnessed the confrontations with the Pharisees and scribes. Pharisees, scribes. They had heard the angry whispers in the crowds and felt the tide of public opinion beginning to turn. Hiding away in this secret upper room only served to heighten their sense of vulnerability. They looked to Jesus for reassurance, for the confident leadership he always provided. But tonight, his calm was tinged with a profound sadness, which only deepened their own anxieties about what was to come. They were followers of a man marked for death. Jesus began to speak, but his words did not immediately turn to the traditional Passover story. Instead, he spoke with a personal and emotional intensity that captured their full attention.
I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer.
The word suffer must have landed like a stone in the quiet room. While he had spoken of his coming death before, hearing it stated so plainly, in the context of their final meal together, made the reality of it unavoidable and terrifying. The disciples exchanged uneasy glances, the meaning of his words slowly dawning on them. This initial interaction set the tone for the entire evening. It was a clear signal that this would be no ordinary meal. The focus was not on the past liberation from Egypt, but on a future event, a suffering that their leader would have to endure. Past liberation from Egypt, a future event, a suffering. This created an atmosphere thick with emotion. There was love, yes, the deep bond between a teacher and his students, but it was intertwined with a growing sense of foreboding and sorrow. The meal had barely begun, and already the disciples were being forced to confront the impending loss of the man at the center of their world. The arrangement of seating at the table was not random. It held social significance. In cultures of that time, the places of honor were next to the host. The disciple John, often referred to as the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to Jesus, so close he could lean his head back on Jesus' chest. This position signified a special intimacy and friendship. On the other side of Jesus was likely Judas Iscariot. This placement is tragically ironic. It put the betrayer in a position of honor and trust, highlighting the deep and personal nature of the betrayal that was about to unfold. The other disciples arranged themselves around the table, unaware of the serpent nestled so close to their master. Peter, ever eager to be near Jesus, was likely seated across from him or close enough to gesture and speak to John directly. This seating arrangement would become important later in the evening when Peter wanted to ask a crucial question without disrupting the entire group. The physical closeness of the disciples around the table reflected their years of shared experience. They were a family, a tight-knit band of brothers. Yet the seating also created a subtle hierarchy and proximity that would play into the dramatic events of the night, positioning each man for the role he was about to play in the unfolding story. After Jesus' initial sobering words about his desire to share this meal before his suffering, a deep silence likely fell upon the room. What could they say in response to such a statement? Fishermen, tax collectors, laborers, simple men who were out of their depth. They were confronted with a prophecy of pain from the man they believed to be the Messiah, the one who was supposed to restore a kingdom. The contradiction was confusing and frightening. The silence was filled with their unspoken questions, their fears, and their dawning grief. Each man was lost in his own thoughts, trying to process the unthinkable. This silence was more than just an absence of noise. It was a heavy, meaningful pause before the storm. It was a moment of collective contemplation, as the disciples tried to reconcile the man they knew with the fate he described. Jesus allowed this silence to hang in the air, letting the weight of his words sink in. He knew he had to guide them through this night, to give them the tools they would need to survive what was coming. The first part of his final lesson was this shared, somber stillness, a quiet acknowledgement of the sorrow that had now joined them at the table. The meal was ready, but their hearts were not. As the disciples sat in the heavy silence, still processing their teacher's somber words, Jesus did something completely unexpected. He stood up from the table, his movements deliberate and calm. He quietly took off his outer robe, the garment of a respected rabbi, setting it aside. Then, he picked up a simple linen towel and wrapped it around his waist, adopting the attire of the lowliest house servant. This action alone would have been enough to confuse his followers. Their leader, the man they called Master, was dressing himself as a slave. The disciples watched him, their brows furrowed in confusion, wondering what he could possibly be doing. He was inverting the entire social order right before their eyes. Next, Jesus poured water into a basin. This was the water that would normally be used by a servant to wash the dusty, tired feet of arriving guests. It was considered a menial, even degrading task, reserved for the lowest person in the household. No one at the table would have ever considered performing this duty for another, let alone for their esteemed teacher. But Jesus knelt down, the basin of water beside him, and began to move toward his disciples. He was about to perform the job of a servant for the very men who had pledged to serve him. The room was filled with a stunned silence as they watched him, unable to comprehend the scene unfolding. He began with the first disciple, gently taking his feet into his hands. These were the feet of working men, calloused and dirty from the dusty roads of Judea. Without a word, Jesus began to wash them, carefully and thoroughly. He then took the linen towel he was wearing and tenderly dried them. He moved from one disciple to the next, repeating this incredible act of service. He, their Lord and Master, was kneeling before each of them, washing away the grime of their journey. This was a radical and powerful demonstration, a physical sermon that would communicate more than words ever could. It was a picture of divine love in its most humble form. The disciples were speechless, a mix of awe and embarrassment on their faces. They were in the presence of an act so countercultural and so profound that it defied all their expectations of a leader, a Messiah, a king. They had argued amongst themselves about who was the greatest in Jesus' coming kingdom. Now the one they all agreed was the greatest was on his knees, washing their feet like a common slave. This was not a lesson they had anticipated. It was a shocking, visceral experience that challenged their deepest assumptions about power, greatness, and the nature of the man they had chosen to follow. When Jesus came to Simon Peter, the ever-impulsive and outspoken disciple could not remain silent. The sight of his master kneeling was too much to bear.
Lord, are you going to wash my feet?
The question brimmed with disbelief and horrified respect. In Peter's mind, the roles were reversed. He should wash Jesus' feet, not be washed. He could not accept this reversal. It felt wrong and deeply unsettling. Jesus looked up, gaze steady and patient.
You do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand.
The full meaning was beyond them, a symbolic act whose meaning would be clear later.
No, you shall never wash my feet.
His refusal came from misplaced honor. He couldn't accept his Lord's humiliation.
Unless I wash you, you have no part with me.
The washing became more than cleaning, acceptance, spiritual cleansing, being part of Jesus' mission and identity. The act opened a deeper communion. Peter, fearing separation from his master, reversed himself.
Then, Lord, not just my feet, my hands, my head.
After Jesus washed all their feet, including Judas's feet, he put his robe back on and sat down.
Do you understand what I have done for you? You call me teacher, Lord. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example.
True greatness in my kingdom is not found in being served, but in serving others. With the powerful lesson on humility still settling in their hearts, the atmosphere in the room shifted once again. Jesus looked at his friends, his expression now one of deep love and connection. He had shown them the nature of true leadership through his service. And now he wanted to redefine the nature of their relationship with him and with each other. He spoke to them not just as a teacher to his students, but as a friend to his friends. It was a moment of profound intimacy, a quiet space carved out before the coming storm. He wanted to fortify them with a new understanding of love that would sustain them through the trials ahead. The disciples, humbled and perhaps a little shaken by the foot washing, listened intently. The earlier feelings of anxiety and fear had not vanished, but they were now mixed with a sense of awe. They were beginning to see that Jesus' kingdom operated on principles entirely different from the world they knew. They shared their feelings not just in words but in their expressions and their quiet attention. They were a small band of brothers, huddled together in this upper room, clinging to the words of their leader as the world outside grew darker and more hostile. Their friendship was the bedrock upon which Jesus was building his final message. It was in this context of friendship and impending fear that Jesus gave them what he called a new commandment. He said, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another." This was not just a suggestion, it was a mandate. The love he commanded was not ordinary affection, it was a radical, self-sacrificial love, the same kind he had just demonstrated by washing their feet, and the same kind he was about to demonstrate on the cross. This love was to be the defining characteristic of his followers, the ultimate sign to the world that they belonged to him. This new commandment was both a comfort and a challenge. It was a comfort because it bound them together in a community of mutual care and support, a family that would endure even after he was gone. It was a challenge because it called them to a standard of love that was divine in its origin and selfless in its practice. As they sat there, sharing this final meal, they were being equipped with the essential tool for their future mission. Their feelings of fear were still present, but now they were also armed with a new weapon against the darkness, a command to love one another as their friend, their Lord, had loved them. After the profound lesson of the foot washing, the meal itself began. The traditional elements of the Passover Seder were on the table, each with its own deep historical meaning. But Jesus was about to give these ancient symbols a new and startling significance. He reached for the loaf of unleavened bread, the matzah. This bread represented the haste of the Israelites' escape from Egypt, baked without yeast because there was no time to let it rise. It was a symbol of freedom from bondage. The disciples would have expected Jesus to recite the traditional blessing, retelling the story of their ancestors. The ritual was familiar, comforting, and deeply ingrained in their identity. But Jesus did not follow the ancient script. He took the bread and after giving thanks to God, he broke it. The sound of the brittle bread snapping in the quiet room must have been sharp and arresting.
Take and eat, this is my body.
This statement must have been utterly shocking. He was taking this symbol of historical liberation and identifying it with his own physical self. He was telling them that his own body was to be broken, just like the bread he held in his hands. The disciples took the pieces of bread, their minds struggling to comprehend the meaning. What could he possibly mean? They were eating a Passover meal, but their teacher was speaking of his own body. This was a radical departure from any tradition they knew. Jesus was shifting the focus from a past event in their nation's history to a future event that would happen to him personally. He was inviting them to participate in his own sacrifice. The act of eating the bread became a profound personal connection to the suffering he had just foretold. It was no longer just a memorial of the past, it was a foretaste of the future. In that moment, Jesus instituted a new ritual. He was teaching them that his impending death was not a tragic accident or a defeat, but a purposeful sacrifice. His body would be broken for them, for their spiritual freedom, just as the Passover lamb had been sacrificed for the physical freedom of their ancestors. This simple act of breaking and sharing bread was transformed into the First Communion, a sacrament that would become the central act of worship for billions. He was giving them a way to remember him, a tangible way to connect with his sacrifice long after he was gone. After they had eaten the bread, the meal continued. As was the custom during the Passover Seder, there were several cups of wine shared throughout the evening. Each cup had its own blessing and significance. When the time came for the third cup, often called the cup of redemption, Jesus once again departed from tradition. He took the cup, which was filled with the deep red wine. The wine was symbolic of the lamb's blood that had protected the Israelite firstborns in Egypt. He held it up before his disciples. The air was thick with anticipation as he prepared to speak again.
Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, he explained. which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins.
Just as he had identified the bread with his body, he now identified the wine with his blood. He was explicitly connecting his own impending death with the forgiveness of sins, establishing a new and final covenant. The concept of a covenant sealed with blood was familiar to them. In the time of Moses, a covenant between God and Israel had been sealed with the blood of sacrificed animals, but Jesus was declaring that his own blood would seal a new, superior covenant. This was not a covenant for one nation but for many. It was a promise of forgiveness and a new beginning, made possible not by the blood of lambs, but by his own life's blood, which he would willingly pour out. The disciples sharing the cup were participating in the inauguration of this new promise, even if they could not yet grasp its full, world-altering implications.
I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom.
This was a statement of both farewell and hope. It confirmed that this was indeed their last supper together in this life. But it also pointed forward to a future celebration, a great banquet in the kingdom of God where they would all be reunited. He was sealing a promise for the future, giving them a hope to cling to through the darkness that was about to descend upon them. As the weight of his words about his body and blood settled upon the disciples, Jesus' demeanor shifted again. A look of deep trouble and sorrow crossed his face. The atmosphere became intensely charged with a new, more personal pain. He looked around at the faces of the men gathered with him, the men he had chosen, lived with and loved for 3 years.
Then he made a devastating announcement. "Truly I tell you," he said, his voice heavy with grief, "one of you will betray me."
The words hung in the air, sharp and unbelievable. A wave of shock and horror washed over the disciples. Betray him? It was unthinkable. His loyal followers, his inner circle, his friends. The statement plunged the room into immediate turmoil. The men began to look at one another, confusion, fear, suspicion. Who could it be? The trust that had bound them together was instantly fractured. Each man began to question his brothers and also himself. Was it possible they could be capable of such a monstrous act?
The accusation felt intensely personal to each one. One by one they began to ask the burning question, "Surely you don't mean me, Lord?"
The question was repeated around the table, a chorus of panicked denial. Each disciple had to confront the possibility of his own failure. Peter asked. John was bewildered. Even Judas asked, feigning innocence. The bonds of friendship and loyalty were being tested. Jesus did not immediately identify the betrayer. Instead, he answered in a way that heightened the tension. "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me." This was a devastating detail. Sharing a dish was a sign of intimacy and friendship. Not a distant enemy, but someone sharing this final, sacred meal. Someone close enough to dip his bread into the same bowl as the master. The betrayal was the act of a trusted friend. After the shocking revelation of a betrayer in their midst, the mood in the upper room was one of profound distress and confusion. The disciples were reeling, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear, sorrow, and suspicion.
In this crucible of raw emotion, Jesus did not leave them to founder in their anxiety. He began to deliver a cascade of final teachings, urgent messages to guide them through the coming darkness.
He knew his time with them was measured in mere hours.
And he spoke with the intensity of a father giving last instructions to his beloved children.
His words shifted from prophecy of betrayal to promises of hope and guidance.
He looked at his bewildered friends and offered a path through their confusion. "Do not let your hearts be troubled."
He spoke of his Father's house, a place with many rooms, a vast, welcoming home. He was going there to prepare a place for them. This reframed his departure not as an end, but as a necessary step for their eternal future.
"Lord, we don't know where you are going. How can we know the way?"
Jesus' response was one of the most powerful and defining statements of his ministry. He did not give them a map or a set of directions. Instead, he declared, "I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. No one comes to the Father except through me."
He was telling them that the path to God was not a place or a set of rules, but a person, himself. He was their living, breathing roadmap to the Father. This teaching was revolutionary. It centered their entire faith and hope not on a system or a philosophy, but on a relationship with him. He was the embodiment of all truth and the source of all life. As the disciples listened, they were being given the foundational pillars of a new faith. The betrayal still hung in the air, a painful and unresolved wound, but Jesus was already applying the balm of his final lessons. He was comforting them, teaching them, and pointing them toward a hope that was greater than their immediate fear, a hope anchored in who he was and what he was promising to do for them. As Jesus continued his farewell discourse, he could see the fear and sadness etched on the faces of his friends. They were about to lose their leader, their protector, their guide. The thought of facing the hostile world without him was terrifying. Understanding their deep-seated fear of abandonment, Jesus made them an incredible promise. He would not leave them as orphans, alone and helpless in the world. He assured them he would ask the Father, and the Father would give them another advocate, another comforter, to be with them forever. This meant his presence would continue with them in a different form. He called this presence the Spirit of Truth, the Holy Spirit. The world could not accept this Spirit. It neither sees him nor knows him. But for the disciples, it would be different. You know him, Jesus said, for he lives with you and will be in you, an intimacy beyond physical presence. While Jesus walked beside them, this comforter would dwell inside them, a constant internal presence, a source of guidance, comfort, and strength that could never be taken away, a lifeline for the grieving disciples. This comforter would have a crucial role. He would teach them all things and remind them of everything Jesus had said. Their minds were swimming with 3 years of radical teachings, parables, and prophecies. They could not possibly remember or understand it all. The Holy Spirit would be their divine teacher and reminder, illuminating Jesus' words and helping them grasp their true meaning in the years to come. Their education was not over. A deeper understanding was beginning, guided by the Spirit of God. Finally, Jesus bestowed a gift. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. The world's peace was conditional, based on circumstances. Jesus' peace was supernatural, a deep tranquility of heart and mind that would remain even amid turmoil, suffering, and persecution. He equipped them not with weapons or worldly power, but with unshakable inner peace and the promise of a constant divine companion, his final, loving provision for the friends he was about to leave. The Last Supper did not end when the disciples left the upper room. In truth, it has never ended. The echoes of that evening have reverberated through 2 millennia, shaping civilizations, inspiring countless acts of charity, offering hope to billions of souls. The events that unfolded around that simple table, the humble act of service, the breaking of the bread, the sharing of the wine, the promise of a new covenant, became the very heart of a new faith. This was more than a final meal. It was the inauguration of a new way of understanding God, community, and love itself. The legacy of that night is written in the lives of all who have followed the command to do this in remembrance of me. What can we learn from this ancient story in our modern world? The Last Supper teaches us that true leadership is found not in power or authority, but in humble service to others. Greatness is measured by our willingness to kneel and wash the feet of our neighbors. In a world fractured by betrayal and suspicion, the most powerful force for healing is a love that is willing to sacrifice. The bread and wine continue to be shared on tables around the globe, a tangible connection to that night, a reminder of a body broken and blood shed for the sake of forgiveness and reconciliation. The story challenges us to look at our own tables and communities. Are we living out the new commandment to love one another as he loved us? It calls us to be people of hope in our dark nights, trusting the promise of a comforter and a future reunion. The Last Supper is not merely a historical account, it is an invitation to be experienced. Find a place at the table, receive the gifts of grace and forgiveness, and carry that spirit into a world hungry for it. Ultimately, the Last Supper is a story of profound and enduring love. A teacher, on the eve of unimaginable suffering, concerned only with comforting and preparing his friends. He gave them his self in the simple elements of bread and wine. That love, offered so freely long ago, continues to be offered to all. It invites us to experience the most important meal in history as welcome and beloved guests.